So the media would have us believe that it's entirely normal and uneventful and expected and unremarkable that the nominee or presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party had accumulated something like 99% of pledged delegates from the primary elections that technically did take place in the 50 states and a few additional territories. It's just totally, again, something for all us to just politely accept that he has now just withdrawn without real explanation. And I say without explanation because Biden finally emerged from whatever hole he was in. I guess the hole in Delaware, Rehoboth Beach. It's a very, comfortable hole for him out there in Delaware. Corporate capital of the country, by the way, which he weirdly sometimes likes to tout as a credential on his part. But anyway, Biden emerged yesterday at the Oval Office and sat at the Resolute desk and explained to the American public that he officially was no longer seeking the Democratic nomination. But the funny thing was, he actually really provided no explanation. It's just as mysterious, at least officially, in terms of what's in the public record, as to why this apparent switcheroo has taken place. So let's take a look at what old Joe said in his address.
In recent weeks, it's become clear to me that I need to unite my party in this critical endeavor. I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. There is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. But there's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
Okay, so that's just a string of cliches. Pass the torch, younger voices, the time and place is now. He's not actually saying, dear Americans, my fellow Americans, I hereby wish to concede that I lack the cognitive fitness to continue in office, despite having adamantly insisted all this time that I was unimpeachably fit to not just complete my current term in office, which would be until January of 2025, but to run for another 4-year term until age 86. That's how old Joe Biden would have hypothetically been if he had followed through on his adamant assurances and completed a second term. One thing I had done in the past couple of weeks is go around to all these frantic Democratic insiders, anybody I could get a hold of, and ask them, okay, so are you guys really trying to tell us that you have no issue, you see no possible concern with an 86-year-old Joe Biden retaining unilateral authority, sole authority over the United States nuclear arsenal at age 86? And needless to say, very few of them had a particularly persuasive answer to that question. Most of the time, they looked like they had just seen a ghost and were frozen and petrified into inaction and unresponsiveness. But just to kind of underscore the utter bizarreness of what's really transpired, which the media has just memory hold at record speed, let's go back to a defiant letter that Joe Biden issued to Democrats in Congress under his own letterhead on July 8th, 2024. Not July 8th, 2014 or 2004 or even that long ago at all. It was just a couple of weeks ago. And Biden lays out his rationale for why it is that he believes it would actually be profoundly wrong and undemocratic for him to be forcibly pressured out of the race. And so here's the most jarring portion of this letter that I want to just read aloud. I don't know if you're accustomed to reading Joe Biden's written tracts, but I actually happen to read this letter when it was first delivered. And here's what Joe Biden says. We had a Democratic nomination process, and the voters have spoken clearly and decisively. I received over 15 million votes, 87% of the votes cast across the entire nominating process. I have nearly 3,900 delegates, making me the presumptive nominee of our party by a wide margin. This was a process open to anyone who wanted to run. And he goes on to brag that only 3 people chose to challenge me. One fared so badly that he left the primaries to run as an independent. That's a not so thinly veiled jab at Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Biden continues, another attacked me for being too old, and he was soundly defeated. That's Dean Phillips, who I actually also interviewed in New Hampshire in January for a System Update. Joe Biden resoundingly concludes the voters of the Democratic Party have voted. They have chosen me to be the nominee of the party. And he asks, do we now just say this process didn't matter? That the voters don't have a say? Wait a second. Why couldn't you pose the very same question today? This was July 8th. What the heck is today? July 25th? On July 25th, how is this question just rendered magically moot? How have the voters had their say? They're just doing this little switcheroo scheme to impose Kamala Harris through a private coronation with zero voter input, so little voter input that a few nights ago I was giving you all a historical lesson on the parallel or lack thereof with Hubert Humphrey in 1968. I know not everybody nowadays is running around with Hubert Humphrey at the tip of their tongue, but 1968 tends to be the parallel that is most commonly invoked as a precedent for what Joe Biden just did in withdrawing from his pursuit of the nomination. But Hubert Humphrey, who, as I mentioned recently, was at that time the institutional Democratic Party's choice, and he was running against Eugene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, and Robert F. Kennedy Sr., who was a senator from New York and was then assassinated. Hubert Humphrey, the incumbent vice president to Lyndon Johnson, was kind of the almost, somewhat lackluster consensus choice among the institutional or establishment Democratic Party factions in that cycle. But even Humphrey had to go around and do some semblance of public campaigning, like going to petition delegates at state Democratic Party conventions. He didn't just have the nominee or the nomination handed to him through some divine intervention or from on high, like the clouds opened and a light shone down and there was the nomination just rested into Humphrey's hands. No, he actually had to do some public campaigning. And remember, that was before the dawn of the modern primary system where states generally came to allocate their delegates, starting in the 70s, by popular vote outcome vis-a-vis primary elections. So even in that pre-modern primary era, you had candidates who had to take it upon themselves to at least deign to do some degree of public campaigning. Kamala Harris has done none. At least none in pursuit of actually accumulating the requisite delegates to obtain the nomination. And Joe Biden said it better than anybody. He suggests here in his letter that if he were to be forcibly removed by some insider or donor or operative putsch, that would mean the voters no longer have a say. Now, have you heard the New York Times or the Pod Save America guys or MSNBC or CNN or the Washington Post, Ezra Klein, Matthew Iglesias, all these people who were beside themselves with anguish about how Joe Biden needed to do the right thing and pass the torch, which he even repeated their favorite cliche in his Oval Office address. Have you heard them address the substance of what Joe Biden laid out in this letter just a couple of weeks ago? That if this were to be done, if this maneuver were to be executed, and Joe Biden were just to be switched with somebody else, that would render the voters irrelevant in actually contributing their say to the facilitation of a Democratic nominee being chosen. What happened to that? Joe Biden says he feels a deep obligation to the faith and trust of the voters of the Democratic Party. It was their decision to make, he says, not the press, not the pundits, not the big donors, not any selected group of individuals, no matter how well-intentioned. The voters and the voters alone, Biden says, decide the nominee of the Democratic Party. Well, that's certainly not the case anymore, because the voters have been unprecedentedly excluded from the decision as to who the nominee of the Democratic Party will be. Biden finally says, how can we stand for democracy if in our nation, if we just ignore it in our own party? I cannot do that, he concludes. I will not do that. And I'm banging the table now for emphasis, because you can imagine Joe Biden, pensively drafting this letter, and perhaps, maybe in his own mind, maybe he didn't have the physical ability at that point, but you could almost see him symbolically slamming his fist on the table like Khrushchev in the whatever that was, in the early 60s, I think, at his UN speech. But that's a pretty obscure reference. Maybe I shouldn't have made that reference, but hey, it's my show. I could do what I want. So that's an amazing statement for Biden to have made in light of subsequent developments, right? He says, how can we stand for democracy? Because remember, the Democrats love to go around and pontificate that they're the party who have this steadfast commitment to preserving democracy, whereas Donald Trump and the mean old Republicans, they want to destroy democracy, right? That's the thrust of their argument. That was Biden's argument. But Biden's saying, if the Democrats move forward with what the donors and the pundits and the selected groups of insiders want to do, then they'll be undermining their own argument about how the Democrats are these amazing defenders of democracy, heroic saviors of our democratic order, and the Republicans are these nefarious saboteurs. And yet they've done it. And nobody in the media has the presence of mind or the interest to go back and consult this letter that Biden drafted just a couple of weeks ago and say, look, the same rationale that Biden warned about here has now been actualized. That's now what we've been beset with. And I guess the implications of that are now just being dutifully memory holed, as is customary. So let's go to what Joe himself bellowed at a campaign rally in Detroit not long after he sent this letter.
Any other reason in America, they die for that for more than anything else, any disease, any problem. It's sick. And above all else, we're going to stand up for our Constitution and save our democracy.
Okay, so there's the Save Our Democracy line. I mean, that's just totally rote Democratic rhetoric at this point. But obviously the purpose of that letter that he sent was to connect his determination to withstand internal party pressure and remain the nominee to this larger thematic injunction around defending democracy writ large. Yes, against the Republicans, as Joe would put it, but also against Democratic antagonists of his at that time who were trying to force him out of the race.
Folks, you probably noticed there's a lot of speculation lately. What's Joe Biden going to do? Is he going to stay in the race? Is he going to drop out? Here's my answer. I am running, and we're going to win. I'm not going to change that. Just today, the Marist poll released a national poll that has me beating Trump 50 to 48. I don't know all this drop-off that took place. There's so much of my narrative, my campaign is falling apart, they say. I'm the nominee of the Democratic Party, the only Democrat or Republican who has beaten Donald Trump ever. And I'm going to beat him again.
Okay, so I know these clips might now be inconvenient for a lot of the people who just want to rush and exalt Kamala Harris as, the second coming of some intersectionality, triumph for America, and she's going to, ride in on a horse-drawn carriage of democracy or something with, waving the banner of womanhood and abortion and all these other Democratic pet issues, and she'll be the savior against Trump. But I'm sorry, the guy who did receive, whether you like it or not, and it's true, they did manipulate and you might even say rig the 2024 Democratic primaries to ensure that Joe Biden would effectively be guaranteed the nomination with very little challenge. But even so, Biden received the delegates. That was the whole crux of his argument when he was trying to fend off these demands that he relents and buckle to Democratic insider pressure to make way for some new generation of candidate. And where's the Democratic Party's curiosity as to this turn of events? How about the media's curiosity? Ought not we see like some inquisitive New York Times editorials or Vox podcasts or whatever asking, wait a second, Joe Biden couldn't have been more unambiguous just a couple weeks ago that he was staying in the race and that it would have been an anti-democratic coup, essentially, for these insiders and donors and hotshots to get their way and to get him out. But it's all down the memory hole at warp speed. Remember Operation Warp Speed, which under Donald Trump brought us the wonderful COVID vaccine? This is Operation Warp Speed, but for the media, essentially vaccinating us all against the memory that the past several weeks or even months happened. Now we're all supposed to start anew. And Kamala has been graciously handed to us as the answer to all our problems. We're all supposed to be coconut pilled. I frankly don't even want to know fully what that meme is supposed to mean in order to signify one's undying adulation for Kamala. But it's incredible how we're not even being told what led to this ouster. This is unprecedented in American history. I would say, look, I'm not an expert on every single presidential nomination cycle in all of American history, but I know enough to confidently posit that there's nothing like this that really has ever happened, and or to put it another way, there is no apt parallel to what we've just seen transpire, and yet I guess the move is to just jump up and down celebrating this sudden emergence of Kamala with zero voter input as having contributed to her ascendance. And let's go to what Joe bellowed to Morning Joe. So this is some Joe on Joe action. Just a couple of days after he sent that letter, because I don't know, maybe we need to refresh our memory even further with how vehement Biden was, at least ostensibly, at this time, and who he was claiming were his enemies, who he was positioning himself against and positioning himself as defending. He was saying that he was going to stick it to the elites. He was going to defend the average voter, the average Democratic voter, against these unwarranted intrusions from the dastardly elite. So let's hear him on Morning Joe.
Remember all this talk about how I don't have the black support? Come on, give me a break. Come with me. Watch. I'm getting so frustrated by the elites. Now, I'm not talking about you guys, but about the elites in the party who they know so much more. But if any of these guys don't think I should run against me, go ahead, announce for president. Challenge me at the convention.
So there's Biden saying, look, if any of these know-it-alls think they know better than me, Joe, let them challenge me at the convention. Let them throw their hat in the ring. Let them not just maneuver behind the scenes or leak stuff to the media or connive to try to execute this private little ouster plan that they have circulating on their Google Docs and that they're tweeting up a storm about, or they have on their group text. Let them actually put themselves into the glare of public scrutiny and come at me in a public fashion. And they didn't do that. And Biden says there, look, this is an attempted elite imposition. So Joe there is saying that he's standing with the average Joe. So you have Joe Biden, Morning Joe, and Average Joe. Lots of Joes in the mix. I need a cup of Joe to just keep track of them. But the bottom line is that what Biden was warning of was that the elites would have supplanted the expressed will of the average voter, and that was unacceptable, intolerable of the modern Democratic Party, especially if they wanted to maintain their credibility when they make their campaign argument against Trump and the Republicans as being these existential foes of democracy. And that's all gone by the wayside. It's amazing. I almost feel like I could be accused of, dwelling on old news at this point because Biden withdrew on a Sunday. Kamala had all the delegates locked down by Monday or Tuesday. Now we're on Thursday, and everybody's just moved on. I guess in general, what I really despise is this whole memory holing refrain on lots of issues. I mean, not just related to electoral politics or this scheming that went on to bring about the Democratic insiders' preferred outcome. It's just this whole tendency on the part of the elite media class to just conveniently forget stuff that is inconvenient or contradictory to whatever preferred narrative they're trying to promote at any given time because it serves their interests. And this is just another really jarring example of that. So now I want to go, one of the excuses that you hear Democrats often making is that in voting for Biden in the Democratic primaries this year, Democratic primary voters were also voting for Kamala Harris because Kamala Harris is the incumbent vice president, and therefore she more or less is being voted into power for a second time along with Biden. But that's a deliberate misconstrual or misportrayal of what the presidential primary process actually consists of. Look at some of these sample ballots from the primary races. Here we have Connecticut. Do you see Kamala Harris's name on that ballot? I see Joe Biden, uncommitted, Marianne Williamson, Dean Phillips, and Cenk Uygur, who's actually going to be our guest a little later on the show. So I will raise this issue with him, most definitely. Let's go to New York, which is next. I only see Joseph R. Biden Jr. on that ballot. I don't know about you. And then he's accompanied by individual delegates, because in some states, you vote for the candidate, and then they also have the individual delegates who are pledged to that candidate, who you also have the option of voting for. Other states do it differently, where you vote only for the candidate. It's a whole patchwork of different laws and regulations and customs that govern the primary process or the presidential nomination process in each state and territory. That's why the sudden imposition of Kamala is so wild, because candidates have to do a lot of legwork to even get themselves on the ballot. I mean, it's a whole Byzantine network of laws and expectations and requirements that you have to adhere to, even to get yourself into official contention. And Kamala Harris has just been gifted this unbelievable ability to bypass it all and just proclaim herself nominee, essentially, with no public process whatsoever. It's actually staggering. I know I'm doing all my gesticulations and my wild hand movements, and people criticize me for that. But hey, what can I say I'm just moved by the spirit of the ridiculousness of this situation until I have to flail. Okay, so go to the next state. This, I believe, is Michigan. You got Joseph R. Biden Jr., Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., that is, Dean Phillips, Marianne Williamson, uncommitted. So no, if any Democratic partisan tries to tell you that Democratic primary voters voted for Kamala Harris in voting for Joe Biden in the primaries this year, they are lying. Joe Biden had every right, every ability, if he so chose, to select an entirely different vice presidential nominee at the convention. Now, in practice, he almost certainly would not have done that. He would have kept Kamala Harris on his ticket. But it was up to him. There's no vice presidential primary. There are no vice presidential primary ballots that go out to voters, at least in the modern era. Biden would have been fully within his rights to pick an entirely different VP. So no, Kamala was not on the ballot. Whatever spin the Democratic partisans might want to invoke to make it seem as though this were just an unblemished Democratic procedure that led to Kamala being coronated. And then we have one more ballot here, just to underscore the point. Maybe this is excessive, but I have North Carolina. And in that particular primary election, you had a grand total of 2 choices. 1, Joseph R. Biden Jr., and 2, no preference. So it's Biden or bust, essentially. That was how they organized these primaries. And for Democratic insiders, power brokers, pundits, whoever, to now try and claim that Biden went hand in hand with Kamala Harris, they are actively deceiving you because they don't want to actually address the criticism that Biden himself articulated in that letter that we went over just earlier, which is that this whole switcheroo deal would manifestly undermine the Democrats' own argument for how they're these incredible defenders of democracy and they're going to beat back the insurrectionist, anti-democratic, existentially threatening Republicans and Trump. They don't want to address it because there's really nothing to say. They just have to kind of pretend none of this ever happened. And down the memory hole, it all goes. So I want to now refer you to a memo. This was circulated as of July 3rd. It was strategically leaked to friendly media, which is how the Democratic Party does a lot of its dirty dealings, evidently. And these were unnamed Democratic strategists who had a Google Doc. And they weren't named. They didn't put their name to it. But the media still eagerly circulated this memo. And they popularized now what has been this inspiring new slogan to christen Kamala as the savior figure for the Democratic Party, and I guess the nation and even the world, maybe the universe, the cosmos, has been saved by Kamala, according to the current narrative, unburdened by what has been. The case for Kamala. Gee, I'm swelling with pride. I'm swooning to be unburdened by what has been. I mean, funnily, they call Joe Biden a burden, you would think, implicitly, but that's another item that's being tossed right down the memory hole, probably, because now he's being venerated as this hero, right? The new George Washington, relinquishing power. And so I want to now go to an under-noticed or a little-noticed section of this document, which, I mean, these people, whoever wrote this memo, congratulations, you got your way. You schemed to fruition. You achieved your little, insider coup, or whatever you want to call it. First of all, they note that Kamala's best asset, perhaps, is that she's repeatedly demonstrated that she is a strong and capable messenger on our single most important issue, abortion. So that's telling unto itself. These Democratic insiders who were conniving amongst themselves to try to get Biden out of the race and put Kamala in there instead, they are unswerving in their belief that the single most important issue to everyone, I guess, is abortion. Now, I'm not saying abortion is unimportant. I know that it has a certain importance to some, but to just state as though it's objective fact that abortion is just the be-all, end-all for how we, they're invoking this like royal we, kind of orient our issue matrix in terms of what we prioritize. Really, abortion? I mean, nothing else? National security, foreign policy, I mean, the areas where the president wields the most unilateral power by far, life and death, nuclear obliteration, all this stuff, abridging civil liberties or securing them, even economic policy, regulating Wall Street or not. This apparently matters not at all to the Democratic insiders who were so crucial in setting out this little plan to bring about Joe's ouster. But what I also want to point out here is something that we'll also get into with some of our guests. I really love how they phrase this little aside that they include. They say, meaning the unknown pro-Kamala people who drafted the doc, and they say, while the issue is complex and distance here is relative, she, Kamala, is broadly considered to be to Biden's left on Israel-Palestine, an issue where he has major vulnerabilities. So notice they're not saying that on a substantive policy level, Kamala Harris diverges at all from Joe Biden. They're saying she's broadly considered to be to Biden's left, which is an odd way of even phrasing it. So there's a perception that they want to utilize for maximum political effect that has no necessary connection to the underlying policy substance. And that, in a nutshell, I think, is a great encapsulation of the whole Democratic Party tactic here. The perception is that this is new and exciting and we're unburdened now by Joe's foibles. And whether or not that has anything to do with the policy substance at hand, who cares? Let's just march forward with our fun memes and pretend like the past several weeks or months never happened.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.